So with Hinduism, we begin as we always begin. What is the problem that Hinduism sees as central in the world, and what's the solution?
Well, the problem is that we keep being reborn. So in Hinduism develops this idea of samsara, and what samsara means is wandering through or flowing through. And what you're wandering and flowing through is multiple lifetimes. So we're born, we live, we suffer, we die, and we're reborn. And that's seen to be not an opportunity like it is for many who believe in reincarnation in the West, but as a difficulty, as the problem. And we want to get out of that, and we get out of that through moksha, which is spiritual liberation, recognizing the unity of the human self with the divine reality through some manner or method, and that sort of pops us out of this cycle of life, death, and rebirth.
Mm. And you say that Hinduism, of all the major faiths that you study, is the least dogmatic and the most diverse internally.
That's right, because Hindus have had a strategy of meeting with other religions, and they've met with so many of them over the years by basically accommodating and including them. So instead of putting out their arm and saying, no, we have the one true God, your God is false, they say yes, and they bring them in. And so Hinduism over time just becomes, rather than getting sort of more defined over against its enemies, religious enemies, it becomes more and more inclusive of them. So as the Buddhists arrive, then the Hindus say, oh, well, Buddha, he's a incarnation of Vishnu, our god Vishnu, or, oh, here comes Jesus. Oh, he's an incarnation of Vishnu also. So there's a yes rather than a no. And there isn't a pope, there isn't a creed, there isn't a sort of centralized structure that's able to define orthodoxy, nor is there much interest in defining orthodoxy. And so it's just this real big tent of a religion, Hinduism.
And that's why Hinduism has a reputation for being among the most tolerant religions.
That's right, because it has this accommodative sort of elastic strategy of inclusion rather than exclusion.
Now, let's talk for a minute about the origins of Hinduism. When can you date it from? And I believe it emerged in the Indus Valley of India.
Yeah, it goes back really far. I mean, it's one of our most ancient religions. We have this sort of proto-Hinduism or of a pre-Hinduism that's called Indus Valley civilization that maybe goes back to something like 2500 to 1500 BCE, before Jesus. And here we have sort of hints of the possibilities of Hinduism. We don't have a sense of the idea of samsara and moksha that I just described, but we have some female goddesses that may have been worshipped. We have some images of possibly divinities doing something that's like yoga. We have animals that seem to be sacrificed. We have ritual bathing. We have some things, some building blocks of Hinduism, basically, that seem to be there.
And there's no, one person you can name as a founder of Hinduism. Like you could talk about Confucius or Jesus or Mohammed or something.
That's right. It just sort of recedes back into ancienter history. We don't have a founder.
And then from the Indus Valley, then it proceeds into what you call a Vedic religion.
That's right. And I think of these in sort of geological terms as different layers in the geology of Hinduism, where the first layer is Indus Valley civilization and the second layer on top of it is Vedic religion. But as in real geology, the layers get thinner and thicker and kind of interpenetrate to one another. So it's not a simple moving forward. But in the Vedic religion, you have these texts that are called the Vedas, which are the oldest of the Hindu scriptures. And these Vedas are basically they're ritual manuals. They're not really philosophical texts or even mythological texts so much. They're more written to priests of this is how you do the ritual. This is what you do first, and this is what you do next. And you do have gods. So we have a kind of polytheistic worldview where we have, for example, the god of fire, who is Agni, and the word Agni is related in English to the word ignite, so it has that notion of fire and heat. We have a god of war and weather called Indra, And the divinities, some of these divinities will persist later on in Hinduism, and the sort of minor deities will become major, and major will become minor. But we're moving in the direction of sacrifice and something that looks more like Hinduism.
And then you move into the karmic path, which you call philosophical Hinduism, and which you say is really kind of difficult to understand, actually.
Yeah, and I don't so much think of philosophical Hinduism as the karmic path. Karma we see in the Vedic period, and it has to do, karma means action. It has to do more with ritual action. And gradually it's going to evolve to a notion of ethical action, which is how we think of it now, sort of what goes around comes around. In philosophical Hinduism, which is what when we finally get, real Hinduism, which with this problem of samsara and the solution of moksha, we're getting in that sort of first millennium BCE, we get these texts called the Upanishads. And in the Upanishads, we have these thinkers who are saying, well, what's the point of the Vedic ritual? Maybe the point of the Vedic ritual is to get at reality. What is reality? That's the relation of the individual to reality, to the self to reality. Are there many gods? Are there one God? And darn it, we're stuck in this cycle. We seem to be being reborn over and over again. How can we get out of it? And the Upanishads start to address these kinds of philosophical and religious problems. And it's in these texts and the rituals that are associated with them that we start to get what we think of as Hinduism today.
And the Hinduism today, you say, is more like something called Bhakti yoga?
That's right.
Path?
What happened, I think this happens in a lot of religions too, is that it starts with elites doing really difficult things. In the case of Hinduism, elites who are leaving their family, leaving their jobs, leaving their names even, going out and wandering across the face of India to search for a solution to the problem of life, death, and rebirth. And the solution that they discover is that through various austerities and meditation and thought, you can realize the unity of the self with God, of what they call the Atman, which is the self or the soul of the human being, with Brahman, which is the impersonal divinity. And that's the goal, is to realize the unity of self and God, and through that to break out of the karmically driven cycle of life, death, and rebirth. But that's very hard to do. You have to, do religion kind of 24/7. You have to leave your wife, because this is mostly men. You have to stop doing your job. And over time, the tradition democratizes. And by the time we get to around the beginning of the Common Era, around the time of the emergence of Christianity and the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism and the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism, the northern style of Buddhism, you get this Bhakti Hinduism or devotional Hinduism, where you can get the religious goal of moksha simply by loving a god of your choosing. You no longer have to drop out of your work. You no longer have to leave your spouse. Mm-hmm. You no longer have to do this 24/7. This can sort of be a sidelight in a way to your life, or a part of your life, but not you don't have to be a sannyasin. You don't have to be a renouncer who renounces life in the world.
Part of the title of this period, though, is Bhakti Yoga, and a lot of us connect yoga with Hinduism. And, of course, a lot of people today use yoga for everything under the sun that doesn't have anything to do with religion. They do it for well-being, to lose weight, for whatever. What's the connection of yoga to Hinduism?
Well, yoga is a discipline. So yoga is a discipline you would use to get some goal. And the classic goal for yoga in ancient Hinduism, and it is a Hindu practice, would be to achieve that union of self and God. So it would be it's related to the word yoke. So you yoke the self to God in order to achieve moksha, in order to achieve spiritual liberation. And that was the original idea. It wasn't, you were doing it to lose weight, or you were doing it like to meet pretty women or something like that, like we sometimes have in America. But you would be doing it to realize the deathless, eternal part of yourself, and to yoke it to the deathless, eternal reality out there, which is Brahman.
Now, in terms of religious texts, there are the Vedas, the Upanishads, but the one that's considered the most important, I believe, in Hinduism is the Bhagavad Gita. which is, you say, a dialogue on the ethics of war. Can you talk about that book?
Yeah, so what happens, which to me is fascinating in the development of Hinduism, is you move from scriptures in the Vedas, which are ritual manuals, to scriptures with the Upanishads, which are philosophical texts, to stories, to epics. And the tradition really now becomes more of a narrative and storytelling tradition. And these are massive stories, like in the Mahabharata, which is the broader text that the Bhagavad Gita is a teeny piece of. These are many, many times over the length of the Bible. And in the Bhagavad Gita, what you have is a war between two families, and you have this person, Arjuna, who's in the Pandava family, and he's about to go to war, and it's his duty, according to the caste ethics of Hinduism, as a warrior to fight. That's what warriors do. They fight. But he realizes that as he goes to war, he's going to be fighting with his kinsmen, with his cousins, and he's going to have to kill them. And that's not good, So he's sort of caught between two duties, two kinds of duty. And he gets in basically a philosophical discussion with his charioteer, who turns out to be Krishna. This is a lovely thing about Hindu epics, is that you never really know who's who.
Mm-hmm.
People can sort of shapeshift and take different forms, and it's fascinating. So anyway, and the argument becomes, fight and do the war, says the charioteer, who is Krishna, but don't be attached to the fruits of your actions. In other words, give them up to God. And it develops in this text a new way of being a Hindu, where you can get to the goal of moksha through a kind of renunciation of philosophical Hinduism, but you can also get there by loving God, and you can also get there by action in the world. And so it opens up the Hindu religious goal to all kinds of people, including warriors, including everyday housewives and husbands.
And what about the Ramayana?
Well, this is a love story. So you kind of have a great war story, and then you have a great love story. And the Ramayana is a text about Rama, who is a god, and his wife Sita. And part of why this story is so beloved is because Sita is this sort of endlessly faithful wife who keeps getting into trouble through no fault of her own, and then being accused of various torts, faults that always turn out to be false. And she's this sort of wonderfully faithful person. But basically she's kidnapped by this demon king Ravana and taken away to Lanka, which is thought to be Sri Lanka. And Rama comes with these friends and these other gods to basically vanquish Ravana and save Sita. And of course, they are able to save her. And but eventually it's a kind of a fabulous ending. She sort of disappears into the earth rather than ending up with her husband. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah, you say it's one of the most influential books of all time.
That's right, because it is incredibly powerful among Hindus in India, but it travels very widely, and it becomes a beloved story among many Buddhists. And in Bali, it's the sort of core story that's told with the puppeteers there in Balinese Hinduism.
Now, is Hinduism linked at all to the caste system in India?
Oh my gosh, I get in so much trouble about this. I had a little fight in D.C. the other day with a Hindu about this. Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, a lot of contemporary Hindus want to say, make this sort of culture, social, religious distinction and say, well, that's a cultural thing. It has nothing to do with Hinduism. And of course,
I've had Hindus say that to me on this show.
Yeah, and it was banished, by the British, hundreds of years ago, but it persists. And if you're in India, everybody in India knows the caste of everybody else. I mean, it's quite astonishing. And so it isn't like this has gone away. And it is related. It goes back to the Vedic texts, and it's very, very ancient and very much integrated in all sorts of ways into Hinduism. There's a story about how the world is created through the dismemberment of this sort of Purusha, this sort of primordial human, and out of this ritual sacrifice, essentially, you get the various parts of the body becoming the various castes. The upper body, head becoming the priests, and the feet becoming, the outcasts, and the thighs becoming the laborers, and the arms becoming the warriors. And So yes, caste is part of Hinduism. It's something that Hindus in the West are embarrassed about. It's something that intellectuals try to banish, but it has traditionally been a part of the religion, and it persists against the better judgment of many Hindus. It's something that's still there in the culture today.
And I think it would be fair to say the majority of Hindus do want to get rid of it.
Well, they want to get rid of it, but they don't want their kids to marry outside of their caste.
Oh, okay.
So,
that's
I mean,
the tradition in
I mean,
India, yeah.
Well, it's the tradition in America too. I mean, my students at Boston University are pretty much marrying inside their caste. It's pretty unusual for people to be marrying outside their caste still.
Now, the gods of Hinduism. There are many and they're colorful. In fact, this is probably the most colorful of all the religions that you describe. You know, you have Ganesha, who has the head of an elephant. You have the woman who's dancing with, I forget, 8 arms, I think it is. Who are these gods? Describe that pantheon, if you will, in Hinduism.
Right. Let me say quickly that there are many Hindus, both in America and in India, who say there's only one God in Hinduism. So there's a fascinating debate about whether Hinduism is monotheistic or polytheistic. On the surface, it certainly seems to be polytheistic because you have all these gods and they talk to each other, they fight with each other, they tease and trick each other. They have these fabulous epics written about them. And on that level of multiple gods, there's often said to be a trinity where there's Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the sustainer, and Shiva, the destroyer. So when the world needs to be created, that's Brahma's job. When the world needs to be sustained, that's Vishnu's job. When the world needs to be destroyed, that's Shiva's job. And remember this problem, this master metaphor in Hinduism of samsara, the wandering, flowing through cycle of life, death, and rebirth, that applies to human life, but also applies to the cosmos. So the world we're living in now was created at one point, but before that it was created, another cosmos was destroyed and previously created, etc. So these gods have these sort of massively important roles. But Brahma really isn't much worshipped in India, so you're not going to find a lot of Brahma temples. Brahma is a little bit like the high god actually in the Yoruba tradition, but also the god of deism that sort of makes the world but doesn't really have much of a job. So the real trinity, I think, is really Vishnu and Shiva and then the Mahadevi, the great goddess, which is interesting that there are female divinities in Hinduism that are very important, and this is one feature of Hinduism that's very attractive to feminists.
Yes, that's certainly true. Now, there is also a fascinating set of prayers and rituals in Hinduism, and I know that I visited an ashram that was founded by a Hindu, and I was at the puja, which is their central ritual. And it certainly flourishes in symbolism. I can remember, since I'm a Roman Catholic myself, I looked and I thought, my goodness, Hindus are the Roman Catholics of the East in the sense of their use of symbols, almost sacramental kinds of signs. Can you talk about the puja or the rituals of Hinduism?
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I think there's something to that. I hadn't actually thought about that so much in the sense that in Catholicism you have sacraments that you have to have stuff for them, right? You have to have wine or bread or water or oil. And similarly, stuff is part of Hindu rituals too, right? You have fire, you have rice that's given as an offering. And it's fascinating. It's amazing. If you go to a Hindu temple, they don't have services typically in the same way that you think of. Oh, you go to church at 11 in the morning. Temples are just open, and you just go by yourself with your family, and you bring an offering to the divinity, and then you're given something back. So often you'll bring food, and then you're given back this food that's kind of been made sacred by the god and by the priest inside the temple. My colleague Diana Eck at Harvard has written this wonderful book about Hindu puja, Hindu ritual, where she argues that what is really the core of the puja is actually sight. In other words, that it's about seeing and being seen. And the word in Hinduism is darshan. And she says, when you go to temple, you go not to worship, but you go for darshan, you go to see and be seen. Now, that's not like going to a nightclub to see and be seen, because you're not being seen by others, you're being seen by the divinity. and you go and you sort of circumambulate the temple, not quite looking at the images, and then you circumambulate the central image, and maybe it's of Ganesha, maybe it's of Shiva, and then finally you go to the central image, and you then have this moment when you look the god in the eye, and the god looks you in the eye, and you have this moment of intimate encounter that is that devotion, that is the Hindu way of devotion, as I call it in the book, where you have this kind of love exchange between the two of you. And I'm persuaded by that. I think that is what Hinduism is about. And I would add that it's not about worshiping stones and idols. Hindus know that these images are, made by some guy who's a good stone carver, right? Mm-hmm. They know that they're manufactured. But the gods are invited into the image. And once they're invited in, by the placement of the eyes, by the way, which is interesting. It reinforces this idea that the gods become alive through sight. Once you do that, then they require this sort of 24-hour attention because the god really does live inside the image.
And you mentioned darshan. There is a hugging saint of Hinduism called Amma, and she goes around literally hugging people, and she's giving darshan. That's what she says. And that's sort of a spreading of love or compassion.
Yeah, that's right. And and she's sort of internationally famous, and I think that epitomizes the way of devotion piece of Hinduism, but it also epitomizes the fact that in Hinduism you have a kind of fluidity between who's a god and who's a human. I talked earlier about how you achieve spiritual liberation or moksha by realizing that there really isn't a distinction between the self, the Atman, the essence of the human being, and Brahman, the essence of God. And since that's the case, humans can be, living humans even, can be gods of a sort, to whom you can go and have darshan, to whom you can devote yourself in a way. And this makes, especially Christians in the West, really nervous, because it sounds like idolatry, right? You're worshiping, how can you worship another human being? But humans can have that capacity in the Hindu tradition.
Mm-hmm. And just a footnote on the puja, I remember incense, flower petals in the air, all sorts of incredible symbols. I felt right at home, let me say.
Yeah, and the color, right?
Yes.
India is kind of a riot of color and sound and sort of hyper-stimulation. And I think that's also going on for sure inside the Hindu temples.
Now, there are monks and nuns, or sannyasis, in Hinduism. These are the people who are renunciants, I believe they're called. They renounce certain things in life.
That's right. And they're in this philosophical Hinduism, this sort of Upanishadic Hinduism, where they're renouncing their ordinary social life, their life as what's called a householder. They actually have a ceremony where it's like a death ceremony, where they're leaving their spouse, they're leaving their kids, they're leaving their job, they're leaving their community to go out and wander. And if you walk up to them later and refer to them by their birth name, they're not even supposed to respond because they're a different person. They've been, we might say, born again, right? But they've become a totally different being because they've renounced the ties and the social obligations that we all have. And they're not supposed to do the kinds of things that ordinary – in other words, they don't have the duties that the rest of us have of, say, supporting our children because they've gone on to have this other duty, which is to seek moksha. And they then wander around India. And they have this wonderful idea that the fire that is in the Vedic rituals and that also shows up in the pujas in the temples is now not just at the altar, but it's inside them. They carry that sort of eternal fire, eternal flame inside them and draw a kind of sustenance from it. And
the sannyasis that I have met at the ashram in Southern Virginia that I have visited, actually they don't wander. They live there. They're more there to service the ashram, to carry out certain kinds of ministries almost. And it's not evidently a permanent lifestyle. I know at least one of them who has left it and gone back to married life. Right. And this is true of all traditions. They have, people will
it's a sort of divorce almost, right? That you go into the you make a vow and a commitment to the monastic order, and then you might leave. But traditionally in India, the sannyasin, the renunciant, would be wandering. And in fact, that's where the Buddha gets his wandering lifestyle that becomes part of Buddhism, is from that Hindu sannyasin tradition. But as with early Christianity, where you had the wandering monks who ended up settling down and into monasteries, you get the same thing that happens in Hinduism. And part of that has to do with discipline. You get even today in India, there's a lot of wandering monks, but there's also a lot of wandering con men who are just trying to get support that the monks might get from various people.
Yeah.
And you had the same problem with early Christianity. And one reason why the early Christians decided to settle into monasteries was to be able to tell the difference between a con man, a criminal, and a monk. And so yes, we have monasteries in India with Hinduism and in America with Hinduism, but the classic role for that sannyasin would have been to have no abiding place, to have no home.
But you have to know if your beggar, I assume they beg, is for
They
real
do.
or
It's
not. Yeah.
Right. It's a begging tradition. That's right.
All right. And finally, and because I do want to sort of bring this one to a conclusion, how would you characterize Hinduism's influence in the world at large? You say at some point it's the oldest religion. It has 900 million adherents, 15% of the world's population. What about its larger influence?
It has largely been confined to India, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. We have it in Europe. We have it in the United States. We have it in Bali, which is sort of the classic place outside of India that we have Hinduism. Very different form, by the way, that really has very little to do with worshiping images. And in fact, in Bali, you'll find the classic image of God is an empty chair, which I love. It's a kind of mystical invocation, I think, that, sort of invent your own divinity to sit in the chair. But I think Hinduism is a wonderful example of how to get along across religious boundaries. I mean, the Hindus have been, because of their sort of standing at a sort of crossroads in the world, and because of their strategy of inclusion, they've been very good at cultivating conversations from ancient times with Buddhists, with Jains, which is another Indian religion, with Muslims more recently, and then with Christians. And Hindus are very good at this, and I think we can learn from them how to have informed, constructive conversations across religious boundaries without giving up our own religious commitments along the way.
And it's interesting that ashram in Southern Virginia, founded by Swami Satchidananda, who is a disciple of Swami Vivekananda, whom you mention in your book, that's his philosophy. Truth is one, paths are many. And they seem to respect all those various spiritual paths.
And the people that I'm fighting with in my book, God is not one, saying that the religions are very different. Those people are mostly influenced by that tradition, the tradition that runs through Swami Satchidananda at the ashram you visited, who was influenced by Swami Vivekananda, who was influenced by Swami Ramakrishna. And Ramakrishna's argument was that in the experience of us, the experience of God, because God is one, that all the religions really are, in essence one. And that's his theological claim. And I hate to say it, but I argue against that in my book.
Yes, I do know that's the thesis of your book.
But it's a lovely sentiment.
I agree. Anyway, but it has led to a great amount of tolerance on the part of Hindus for people of all kinds of faith traditions.
Yeah, it's led to a kind of tolerance, but I think it's also led, and this is my critical side, it's led to, it's a difficulty of appreciating the religions for really what they are, because you're always wanting them to be, sort of back in your ballpark, kind of doing your thing. So I think, it's a place of tolerance and respect, but the question then becomes, to what extent is that tolerance and respect really informed by an awareness of the differences in the religions, and to what extent is the desire for similarity erasing those differences? Okay.
Stephen Prothero is a professor of religion at Boston University and the author of God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. Thank you so much.
Thank you.